Hi. Oh, you didn't have to do that, but thank you. I'm Ron Kagan, the CEO of the Zoological Society. I see a lot of coats. I can't understand why. Such a lovely day out. A bunch of us were supposed to go to the Tigers game with Bill Fraser and his family after this talk. Unfortunately, they canceled the game. So you're in for a real treat. Some of you have met Bill Fraser before, or some of you have seen his talk before, a different talk. Some of you might have read the book about him. I'm not sure, maybe some of you even brought the book. If you did, Bill, after the lecture, is more than happy to sign it for you. I'm just going to share a couple of very quick thoughts because you've come here to listen to Bill, not to me. As somebody who spent a number of years in the scientific community before I became an administrator, I can tell you that often the world of science is not necessarily exactly what you think it is when you see wonderful movies on National Geographic or other areas. There is an enormous amount of very difficult work that goes on, especially with field work, where you spend months and years collecting data and you're not sure whether you're going to be able to make sense of it. The idea that somebody could be doing that for over 40 years in the most hostile environment on this planet is kind of remarkable. And the really awesome thing is that Bill didn't go crazy. He is absolutely a wonderful human being. And fortunately, for the past 3.5 years, Bill has been working with us to help us make sure that our knowledge about penguins in captivity is broadened by our understanding of penguins in the wild, and even more importantly, the real story about Antarctica, because the whole idea of building the Polk Penguin Conservation Center was not simply to build a better penguin exhibit, but to build something that had a very powerful programmatic agenda that would help our community, and maybe beyond Metro Detroit, to help our community understand what's going on around the planet. And it's frankly easiest to understand that by understanding what's happening at the two ends of the earth. So tonight, Bill is going to give you a peek into this extraordinary place that has been drawing people for many years, including famous explorers like Sir Ernest Shackleton, and is really like nowhere else on the planet. But the story is really important, and when you think about nature, we always think about the resilience, and it is remarkable how resilient our planet is. But the story is a little alarming, and what we need to do is think about what Bill shares with us and then think about what we need to be doing, because we cannot be complacent. Otherwise, things are really going to turn out horribly. So, I am thrilled to welcome back to Detroit Dr. Bill Fraser. Bill?
All right, thanks for that introduction, Ron. And I just want to say that anyone that is here tonight rates very high with me, because this is Antarctic weather in Detroit, and you've come here to hear me talk about Antarctica. So you people are very hardcore, or insane, which is what we have been labeled occasionally as being. But this story that you're going to hear tonight has been in development for maybe since 1992. It's a story that we initially sensed, kind of a gut feeling. But the data that confirm what we have felt for a long time, began to develop in just beginning around mid-February of 2016. So this story is brand new, and it's a bit like looking for the needle in the haystack, if I could make that analogy. We've been after this kind of information for a long time. And we finally, I should say, we were in the right place at the right time. I think all of you know that the Detroit Zoological Society is supporting our work. It was funding from the zoo that really helped piece this story together. So I won't say any more in terms of an introduction, but I should say there's some disturbing images in this talk, but that's the way nature works, and it was part of what we captured this year in our research. So one thing I don't want to confuse you right in the beginning, but what happened this year in Antarctica, even though we have a rapidly warming planet, the area where we work is warming at 5 times the global rate. So our midwinter temperatures now are nearly 14 degrees Fahrenheit higher than they were 50 years ago. But within the context of that warming, we had a really cold winter. And that's not unusual because warming is not linear. Nothing in nature is linear. So this very cold winter set up the natural experiment that you're going to learn a little bit more about over the next half hour or so. And then I understand it'll be open to questions, and hopefully I can answer those as well. So let me start with the main penguins that we work with. We've worked with these animals for more than 4 decades. And this is the beginning of the story. This is what we've come to realize over the last 40 years or so. I think most of you will recognize these Adelie, chinstrap, and Gentoo penguins. You can see right off the bat they're all very similar in appearance. And ecologically, they're very similar. They breed in very similar habitats during October, November. They mate. They're kind of monogamous. They retain the same mates year to year. They almost always lay 2 chicks or 2 eggs and produce 2 chicks. Their breeding success is remarkably similar, by which I mean the number of chicks produced per pair is about 1.25. So there is some chick mortality, but they basically produce the same number of chicks every year. And also their diets are almost identical, not completely similar, but krill that you see on the right hand of the screen tends to be the dominant component of the diet. So given these tremendous ecological similarities in these species, if you look at what's happened to their populations over the last 40 years or so, you can see that Adelie penguins, outlined in red, the Adelie penguin populations where we work have basically collapsed. They're down by 80%. Chinstrap penguins are slowly increasing. Their populations are up about 3,000%. But the real winner in this situation are by far Gentoo penguins, which are the subject of this talk tonight. And in the 1970s, there were no Gentoos in the area we were working in. They began to invade our region in 1993, and now their numbers are up more than 23,000%. And that's not a typo. I mean, they're just, their populations are booming. So the question that came to mind as these trends were developing is, why is it that these species that have such similar ecologies are showing these drastically different population trends. I mean, this made absolutely no sense to us. So in the late 1980s, we took part in a cruise into the Weddell Sea, which is on the east side of the Antarctic Peninsula. And for the first time ever, the cruise occurred in wintertime. We observed that Adelie penguins and chinstrap penguins and Gentoo penguins divided winter habitat in different ways. What we found was anywhere that you had sea ice, you had Adelie penguins. Where you had this sort of marginal ice zone and open water, you had chinstrap penguins. And where you had areas along the Antarctic Peninsula that were also ice-free, but they were ice-free because of areas where currents were sweeping between land masses, for example, you had Gentoo penguins. So we deduced that, and we began to sort of look at these species in the way that I've outlined here. Gentoo penguins and chinstrap penguins as being ice intolerant. They don't like environments, they don't like habitats that are with very high ice concentrations. And then we started thinking Adelie penguins were ice dependent because wherever you found sea ice, you found these Adelies. And we published a very controversial paper dealing with this and it was controversial because we made the point that these differences in their population trends may have something to do with global warming or regional warming. And what led us to think that was that some of these data you see here, these are going to be probably, I don't have a lot of these kinds of slides in this talk, but these are pretty useful. But, since 1950, this is what's happened to temperatures in the area where we work in Antarctica. These are midwinter temperatures. This is the temperature during a time of the year when sea ice warms in midwinter. So it's a pretty important trend. And since 1950, we see an average of 7 degrees centigrade increase in temperatures in our region. And not surprising, we see the opposite trend in sea ice. In other words, the warmer this environment gets, the less sea ice that we have regionally. And I might point this out, this is a bit scary. Since 1978 alone, we have lost 100 days of our winter. And by that I mean we have lost 100 days of the ice-making season. This is staggering. As far as we know, this is occurring. Similar trends are being seen in the Arctic now. But just imagine what would happen to, say, the snowpack in the western United States if suddenly 100 days of winter disappeared. It would have huge ecological implications. But anyhow, to get back to the original point, we figured, all right, well, sea ice is declining, so this critical habitat that Adelie penguins need is basically forcing these populations to decrease. And obviously, if you have less sea ice, you have more Gentoo and chinstrap penguins. When we published this, we were severely criticized for it because at the time, the word climate change and climate warming wasn't in vogue. And there was a lot of debate about whether or not ecologists that study seabirds really had anything concrete to say about climate change. But as it turns out, these species that we're working with are super sensitive to climate change. We know that now. There's no more debate about this. But in 1992, when these papers came out, we were really criticized for this whole idea. Some of the criticism was not entirely invalid, and I'll tell you why. It was an explanation that basically encompassed a very large scale. Okay, so people basically said, well, Adelie chinstrap and Gentoo penguins don't eat sea ice, so how can you say that sea ice affects their populations? And that was a valid criticism. So what was absent from our explanation was a mechanism. In other words, how does more or less sea ice translate into more or less of one penguin or another? So this question is what has haunted us, if I could use that as a bit of an exaggeration. That is the question we were after. That's what we wanted to know. How does a change in sea ice translate into a signature that has consequences to the populations of these birds? I lose sleep over this, and there are ecologists that are very happy to just study trends and do all kinds of statistics on them and so on. We don't operate that way. We want to know why. So the story I'm going to tell you tonight is about the discovery of this mechanism, at least with Gentoo penguins. And we know from this discovery that we can apply this to the other two species. So what is the mechanism? All right, let me now show you the rather sad state of our planet during the year 2015. And this is the beginning of the process that eventually led to the discovery we made literally during January, February, and March of this year. But this is what's happening to the planet. This is NOAA data. Basically, record warming throughout much of the world, much warmer than average, warmer than average. The planet was on fire in 2015, except for two places. One of them was up here off the coast of Greenland. The other one was right here near the Antarctic Peninsula. These were cool spots, only two in the entire planet. This is where we work. Here's South America. The Antarctic Peninsula is our main work site. So, in passing, we knew things were, we knew we were looking at a cold winter and probably a cold summer. We didn't at the time realize just how severe a winter had developed on the peninsula. But this is a satellite picture. This is winter 2015. This is data from a beautiful, wonderful Danish website that summarizes all this information for us. I don't know why they have red is ice. It seems to me it should be blue. But anyhow, I'm not going to argue with that. But this is the winter of 2015 in Antarctica. This is our work site right here. This is a massive, massive amount of sea ice. In fact, it is a record amount of sea ice. And to give you some perspective on what I mean by a lot of sea ice, let me show you a winter in which there isn't a lot of sea ice. This is 1993. I won't say this is more of the average situation, but this is a low ice winter. And you'll see the big difference here is that during a low ice winter, you rarely see any sea ice in our study region versus what happened during 2015. I'll also give you a little bit of a hint that's really interesting. Gentoo penguins invaded our study site in 1993. That's the reason I'm showing you this. Not only is there a huge contrast in sea ice conditions, but this was the year that Gentoos sort of made the decision to move into this brand new habitat that had not been occupied by their species previously. So, now sort of scoping down from a continental scale to just the Antarctic Peninsula where we work. This is Anvers Island. And this is during the summer of 2016. So the very, very cold winter carried over into the summer as a very cold summer. And you can see by the coloration here that sea ice hovered between 30% ice cover over the ocean to almost 100%. And one of the really interesting things that went on during the summer is that this red blob that you see here kind of moved in and out. It would move shoreward, then move back out. That was strictly currents and wind doing that. But the point is that pretty severe sea ice conditions tended to cover our study area during the summer. All right, we're going to narrow things down even more. We're scaling down to our actual study site. We are now on the southwest coast of Anvers Island. Palmer Station is here. This is a station where we've worked for more than 4 decades. I have no idea why Google marks this with an airport. No one from Google has ever, I guarantee, has been there. There's no airport there. So, but anyhow, Palmer Station is right here. And what you're seeing basically is much of our study area. We work across roughly 70 square miles of ocean, which is dotted by hundreds of these islands, these archipelagos, throughout the region. But Gentoo penguins occur within this area in 2 sites. One of them is here. This is Biscoe Point. And the other one is out here on the Jubans. Our main study site is here. The reason is that this is a very safe, sort of a safe way to study gentoos. If you're working at Palmer Station, we use Zodiacs, which are open boats. It's much safer to travel from here to here because of the shelter of the glacier than it is to cross open ocean to get to gentoos on the Jubans. So the joke is that if you make a bad decision about weather, your next stop is going to be New Zealand when you're trying to reach the Juban Islands. But what this is what I'm showing you now is basically what gentoos do just about every year in terms of how they feed. A gentoo that leaves Biscoe Point, and I'm going to show you here in a minute, they're wearing satellite tags. They have a travel lane, literally. They all leave Biscoe. They shoot straight out to these areas here. These are the main feeding areas for gentoos on Biscoe Point. And they do this invariably. They do this all the time. And the data I'm showing you are ice-free summers. This is when we began tracking gentoos in 2009. This is what a gentoo does as long as there's no sea ice. Let me show you. We get this information from putting satellite tags on them. I'm going to show you a little video that shows a tag being taken off, which will give you an idea of what the tag looks like and how quickly we can. We're not chasing a bird that has a tag on it. We snag it. The tags are held on with tape and electrical little cable ties. The ties are snipped off. And you can see you have a good picture of the tag there. These tags cost $4,000, and we use duct tape to put them on. The tag comes off. This process takes less than 15 minutes. The bird loses no feathers to speak of because the tape is underneath the feather and holding on to the tag. And the bird looks unhappy, and it probably is, but you release them, and they immediately go back to their chicks. So this is how we acquire this feeding data. And these tags really provide the first glimpses that we've ever had into what these birds are doing at sea. Because in the past, this technology is not new, but it was the technology, the miniaturization of the technology took a long time. So it's taken a while to put tags together that you can put on a bird. Anyhow, these are key foraging areas that are used by these birds annually, as long as there's no sea ice. You'll see this arrow here that actually is kind of meant to go off the screen. I want to show you a really important foraging area that we discovered using these tags. And this is going to floor you. This is the largest concentration of feeding Gentoo penguins ever observed. This is a site, again, about 10 to 15 kilometers. There's about 40 to 50,000 pairs of penguins. When they were first seen, people thought that it was wind on the surface of the ocean, but it's actually feeding gentoos. And you can see they go around and continue. They actually went into this channel. And they're also going clockwise right here. What they're doing, we think, is actually swimming as a unit and concentrating krill and then feeding through the schools. That's speculation, but this is just staggering. But anyhow, couple points. You can see open water here, basically. I mean, they're ice intolerant. They can deal with a little bit of sea ice. But this is very, very classic feeding habitat for a Gentoo penguin. And, you know, the fact there's 50,000 of them there minimum probably substantiates that pretty well. But anyhow, returning back to our very cold summer of 2016 and the sea ice that we had present there. Let me show you what happened during this summer. So here we are, birds that are feeding for years in an ice-free environment. Summer of 2016, the same instruments, we didn't change anything. Suddenly saw the birds, basically they would leave Bisco, come sort of use their normal foraging lanes, but then shoot out literally into the middle of nowhere for these penguins. And, you know, this is where they started feeding around the beginning of January. And remember, this area here, although this photograph doesn't show it, this area here had anywhere from 30% to, in some cases, 100% ice cover. So the ice was forcing them to look for prey in a totally different area, areas that we had not even explored before from the perspective of a foraging area for gentoos. And the critical number here is, you can see it. I don't know if you in the back can see it, but basically, this says 40 to 50 kilometers, right? So normally these gentoos are feeding within 10 to 12 kilometers of their nesting site. Here, it's 5 times that. These birds are really, really having to work to find prey to feed their chicks. So they're covering 40 to 50 kilometers this way, and then 40 to 50 kilometers back. So they're doing 100-kilometer round trips, and they have to do this every day. They can't slack off. They've got chicks that are growing that need to be fed. So these birds are under stress. So here's the beginning of what we saw, and you can see this is mid-February. This is, you know, just a few months ago, a couple months ago. I just got back from Antarctica 2 weeks ago. So this is a brand new story, brand new data. So the question is, what happens when sea ice forces gentoos to feed so far away from their breeding grounds? And by this demographic smoking gun, what I'm implying there goes back to this question, what is the mechanism, this thing that has haunted our studies for a long time? How does sea ice affect these various species? And remember, gentoos are an ice-intolerant species, okay? They don't like sea ice. Here they're dealing with one of the worst winters on record in terms of sea ice and a really icy summer. So this is the natural experiment. Here you have what you might call a warm weather penguin having to suddenly deal with a polar system. Well, by mid-February of this year, first thing that we saw was that these parents began to abandon their chicks. We've never seen this before. Chicks would remain completely unattended for more than 24 hours. And what happens when parents are no longer taking care of the chicks is that the chicks begin to form creches. And creches are just little groups of chicks. Without their parents, these chicks get hungry, they start wandering around. Their inclination is to spend time with any moving object, especially if it looks like another chick. So they sort of huddle together and form these little units called creches. The other thing we saw, which was really disturbing, and you'll see that here. I hope you can see this detail in the back, but this is a young chick that has started to molt. It's starting to lose this downy plumage. And when chicks that size start to molt, it's actually a sign of starvation. Their bodies are saying, you're starving to death. You need to lose your downy plumage. You need to develop an adult plumage so you can get yourself into the water and start feeding. It never works out that way. They basically starve to death. Their bodies just don't have the energy reserves to survive. And so this sign of starvation, this is the first time we've seen this at this time of the year. We've not seen it previously. But sadly, by early March of 2016, not more than 2 weeks later, we started seeing hundreds and hundreds of these Gentoo chicks. These are the little creches I was telling you about. They're sort of huddling with each other and starving together and dying. And we found these scattered everywhere. So by early March, we've got massive numbers of chicks starving. And we were hearing also from some of the other vessels in the area that this was being observed across a much wider area than just where we were working. In our case, we have certain protocols that we follow. We do the same things every year. This did not change that trajectory of our studies. It didn't change our protocols. And by early March, one of the things that we do is that we begin weighing penguin chicks that to us look like they're close to fledging. And what I mean by fledging, again, these are chicks, like you can see here, they've lost most of their downy plumage. These chicks are larger, they're better developed, but these guys begin gathering up on the beaches in preparation to leave the colonies where they were born. And we began weighing chicks like we usually do. And one of the things that we noticed immediately was that all these chicks were nearly 500 grams lighter than they had been in previous years. So the numbers that you're seeing here, this 4,500 grams, say, is the average the average weight of a fledgling in an ice-free summer. And we were seeing chicks that now, during this very cold summer, weighed 3,900 grams. I mean, 500 grams lighter is huge for a chick this size. And this fledgling weights, I should say, are an absolutely critical component in the survival probabilities of a penguin chick. And what I mean by that is the heavier a chick is, the greater the probability that it's going to survive its first winter of life. Most mortality in Adelie penguin chicks occurs during year 1, and most mortality occurs in chicks that are very light. So 4,400 grams is probably what these chicks need to weigh to survive their first year of life. And here we've got chicks that are 500 grams lighter. What that means is, in all probability, that all the chicks that were produced during this cold summer were not going to survive to reproduce. They weren't going to survive to adulthood. So fledgling weights, it kind of the light bulb sort of kind of went off when we saw this going on. You know, here we have an ice-intolerant species, a cold summer, lots of sea ice. The translation is suddenly we have very light penguin chicks that we know are not going to make it during the wintertime. So this is a demographic smoking gun. This is when the light bulb goes on. Holy cow, you know, is this the way sea ice affects these species? Like I said, we continued our work, and the first thing that occurred to us when we actually saw this happening, these very light chicks over in Biscoe Point, we decided, all right, the ultimate proof to what we think is going on is going to be to try and get out here to the Juban Islands and see what's going on there. This is a population we don't study very often. Like I said, it's just very difficult to reach. But our reasoning was, okay, if these long foraging trips are causing this kind of pandemonium on Biscoe Point, in other words, these light chicks, here, chicks that are here on the Jubans that are very close to these feeding hotspots probably aren't dying, and they're probably a lot heavier than they would be on Biscoe. So the entire focus of our work immediately changed from Biscoe to the Juban Islands, and we began sampling both sites as weather permitted. Again, just looking to see if, in fact, these fledgling weights were going to change in chicks that were closer to the food source, even though they were still inhabiting an ice-covered system. And more or less as we predicted, and we're hoping to see these kind of results. This is exactly what we found. This was our first trip to the Juban Islands. I should say Biscoe Point is at the base of this mountain, quite a distance away. But on the Juban Islands, there were absolutely no starving chicks. All the chicks were the size that they should be for this time of the year. And more importantly, when we began to weigh them and compare the weight of these chicks to the one on Biscoe Point, this is what we found. Remember, Biscoe Point, the chicks are about 3,900 grams. Biscoe, during ice-free summers, the chicks are 4,400 grams. And here we have chicks from the Juban Islands, very close to this, to their foraging areas, weighing 4,700 grams. These are enormous chicks. These are enormous Adelie or Gentoo penguin chicks, the heaviest ones that we have ever encountered. And so the way we're looking at this is that, and I should say one thing that's really interesting. If you remember, Gentoo penguins invaded our region in 1993. The first area that they invaded were actually the Juban Islands. So when climate in the early 1990s began to change to favor Gentoo penguins, by which I mean less sea ice in the system, this was the first island that was colonized by them. They've been there a long time, and we now suspect that the reason they colonized this area was simply because there was this very abundant food source very close to them. So this issue about fledging weights is now, it's sort of front and center in terms of trying to understand how sea ice affects these species. And the issue of confidence always comes up in this kind of work. You know, how confident can you be that you've just discovered kind of the mechanism by which sea ice at least affects Gentoo penguins? And, you know, in science, it's almost, we're nearly 100% confident. What I mean by that is that there's a probability of maybe 5% to 1% that we're wrong. But the data right now that are shaping up are so powerfully convincing and statistically convincing that we're pretty sure we're on the right track. We have discovered the mechanism through which sea ice translates to a change in the populations of gentoos. And if you, what I mean by that, if you can imagine that all the gentoos chicks on Biscoe Point are going to starve this year or not survive, that's going to leave a gap in the recruitment of that population a few years from 2016, because these chicks don't return to breed for 2 to 5 years. So if you extend that thought across decades, you can see that during years of as sea ice has decreased in the region, you have better and better recruitment. You've got sort of fatter chicks moving into the system, and populations are going to increase. We still have data that are on their way from Palmer Station. Our field team just left Palmer Station yesterday. They have data with them that we haven't seen yet that will add to this story, but I don't expect it to change very much. So I think it's going to hold. I think it's going to hold pretty well. And what we need to do next is, obviously, one of the things that we're going to look at is if this idea that Adelie penguins do well when there's sea ice. In theory, we should find Adelie penguin fledging weights that were very high this year because there was so much sea ice. That needs to be tested still. You're just seeing the Gentoo story. But I just want to end with this slide, which is kind of where we began. And I'm kind of got this in parentheses, the ultimate natural experiment. We have this massively warming planet. You can't deny that. There's definitely a human footprint attached to the warming. It's probably, we're warming because of human activity. But we're sort of engaged in this natural experiment on a global scale. The planet is warming. Are we in trouble because of this warming? And one of the things that if there's anything that we've learned from our work on penguins in Antarctica and other seabirds, is that climate change is super deceptive. Just like we saw with these gentoos, I think that's sort of the key message here. Everything looks like it's just going along fine until all of a sudden it isn't. And when that transition occurs, it is instantaneous and catastrophic. There's no warning. Gentoos began dying literally from one day to the next. There was no warning this was going to happen on the scale that it did. And so we're studying 3 species in which we're seeing these sorts of effects. If you look at things on a planetary scale, every species out there is dealing with these threshold effects in their habitat. The planet continues to warm, so the vulnerability of these species is increasing and increasing and increasing. And it's not only animals, it's ecosystems, it's sea ice, it's glaciers, it's ice shelves, it's the Arctic that is warming. So one of the things that really, I think, amazes me about some of the results that we obtain there is just we're dealing with these critical thresholds that are being knocked out of balance by a warming planet. And it's occurring on an enormous scale, not just in Antarctica, it's global. So anyhow, I'll end with that and take questions if you have them. But not before I acknowledge some of the people that support our work, and of course Ron and his colleagues here at the Detroit Zoo. We get financial assistance from a number of other institutions, our logistics, but really the people that deserve a lot more credit than I give them are field teams. And I might mention Matthew Porter from the Detroit Zoo was on our field team this year. I don't know if he's in the audience or not, but he's sitting up there. They move so fast all the time that I was not able to get them all in one group to take a picture. So the best I could do was take a picture of one of them. This is Carrie McCaddy. I think she weighs about 90 pounds. That's a stick figure up there. But she is standing on a landscape that is beyond comprehension in its beauty. The interesting thing is that we have not visited this island since 1974. We were able to get out to it this year for the first time in more than 4 decades. And we found the islands absolutely covered wall to wall with Gentoo penguins. So these areas are areas that Gentoos had invaded because of warming. And we know from what we saw with these Gentoos that they too were going to be affected by this very cold summer, though we were not able to hang out here that often. But anyhow, these are the people that deserve most of the credit for a lot of the work we're doing. So thanks very much.
Leave that on. Don't go away. So we're going to take questions, but I want to share 3 quick things with you first. To use a kind of metaphor to help reinforce what Bill was talking about, ecosystems and Earth is incredibly resilient, and we all know that over the course of the history of the planet, there have been a lot of dramatic changes. Every now and then, there's a meteor that hits Earth that very quickly changes weather, climate. If you have 10 volcanoes exploding in 1 year, that dramatically changes climate. But other than that, things happen somewhat slowly. You don't have these dramatic changes. So if you think about the next time you fly, I don't want to scare anyone, but the next time you fly somewhere on a jet, if the jet loses 10 or 20 or 30 rivets, it's unlikely anything happens. But it's the 31st rivet, and then the plane drops. And that's what we're talking about, that you can't ignore these changes, and there is a certain breaking point. And that's what we need to be very concerned about. Now, the other thing is, Bill mentioned, there are winners and losers. You've just seen We were just there in February. You've just seen a story where the Gentoos all of a sudden are losing, and the Adelies, which have been losing for many years on the peninsula, all of a sudden had a great year. And so there's this constant dynamic going on, and under normal circumstances, that happens slowly. When there isn't human intervention, it happens slowly, and most species are able to adapt. Most species can either move or adaptation occurs over time. When things change quickly, it's very difficult for most species of plants and animals to adapt as fast as we're changing the environment. Final thing is just an anecdote, historical anecdote. Yesterday, we had a special event in the Polk Penguin Conservation Center, but yesterday was the 100th anniversary of the day that Ernest Shackleton, who'd been trapped in the Weddell Sea for a year, launched in 3 lifeboats to get to Elephant Island. If you have not read the Shackleton story, you should, and you'll do what I do every time. I've reread it so many times, I don't even know how many. You read this book and you just shake your head. Every page you realize you're shaking your head in disbelief about what they went through. But we have in the Wildlife Interpretive Gallery a special exhibit of all of the photographs that Frank Hurley took, and it's really incredible to see what these men did, and they all survived. Anyway, so let's spend some time, questions for Bill. You're all shocked by the story. I know you.
So, Bill, I'm interested in mechanisms of change. So, do you have data that... Oh, sorry. Bill, I'm interested in the mechanisms of the change also. And so, do you have data about krill concentrations changing with temperature or with sea ice? And then the next question after that is, what do the krill eat, and what are the changes in algae, or how far down can you go in understanding the mechanism of change?
We actually do, like everyone heard that, right? I think there was a mic. We actually do have those data. Our program is part of something called the Palmer Long-Term Ecological Research Program. And it would have been a very long story if I went into the program, but while we're doing this at Palmer Station, our research vessel is sampling from the area that you see where we're working, 400 to 500 kilometers to the south. So every year, we sample 200,000 square miles of the ocean. And part of that sampling involves casting nets and doing tows to look at krill abundance. We've been doing this since 1990. What we can tell you is that in our section of the peninsula, there are no changes in krill. And it might sound odd, but the reason for that is that most of the krill where we work are produced in the south, and they move up because of circulation of the ocean. And in the south of our study area, sea ice has not yet begun to diminish. And krill depend on sea ice to survive winter. They feed on the algae under the ice. So the system further south is complete enough that it's still producing krill. But mechanistically, in terms of what you're asking about mechanisms, that's always been the argument, is that everything is driven by how many krill there are in this system. And we've never been happy with that, because if all these 3 penguins are all eating krill, why are their populations exhibiting these differences? So we've always thought that sea ice kind of mediates interactions between penguins and their food supply. And that's what we have found. We now know how sea ice does this. It does it not by limiting how much food is, how much the abundance of food, but how available it is to them. Sea ice makes it really difficult for gentoos to feed efficiently. And so they produce these light chicks. Yes?
Hi. Okay. So what is the difference in foraging strategies for the Adelies compared to the gentoos that makes sea ice beneficial to them?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
I'm wondering what is the difference in foraging strategies between the Adelies and the gentoos such that the sea ice is beneficial for the Adelies?
There's some evidence that Adelie penguins, even though they're a bit smaller, might be able to literally hold their breath underwater longer than gentoos can. And the presence of an ice cap over their foraging areas may, as a result, not have the same consequences to them. But that's speculative. We actually don't know unequivocally what it is from a foraging perspective that would put one to an advantage over another in terms of their actual behavior. We don't know that, and it's probably going to be a really tough question to get at. All we can see at the level of fledging weights is a translation of foraging effort. You know what I mean? We can tell that gentoos were having a much harder time than Adelies were, and it translated to the weight of their chicks. But behaviorally, that'll be a really tough question to get at.
Are whales making a comeback in Antarctica?
Yes. Whales throughout Antarctica are increasing tremendously. Just in our study site, humpback whales, for example, which were hunted almost to extinction as late as the 1980s, they were still being hunted there, are up about 300%, roughly. And so most species are making a comeback. It's very slow, but it is occurring. All right.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bill. Was there another question? Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Could you tell us a little bit about life at Palmer Station? How do you get there? How often do you leave? How do you get your supplies? What does the base look like?
Holy cow. All right. Let's see. Palmer Station is located roughly 1,000 kilometers south of the tip of South America. So anyone that works at Palmer flies to the tip of South America from various points in the U.S. Once we're in Punta Arenas, Chile. That's the gateway to the U.S. Antarctic program. From the tip of South America, we take one of two vessels, which are owned by the federal government, by the National Science Foundation. One of them is called the Nathaniel Palmer, which is a full-class icebreaker. The other one is called the Lawrence M. Gould, which is an ice-strengthened ship, but not a full icebreaker. Those vessels leave the tip of South America and cross the Drake Passage to the Antarctic Peninsula, and then on to Palmer Station. All our fuel, all our food, all our personnel, all our cargo, everything is delivered to us by these ships. So even though we're fairly close to South America compared to other Antarctic bases, we're actually the most difficult to supply logistically because Other bases, like in the South Pole, for example, or even in McMurdo Station, which are on the New Zealand side, can be supplied by air. We only have ship access. Palmer Station itself is the smallest base in the U.S. program. There's 3 of them. There's Palmer, there's McMurdo, and there's South Pole. Palmer is the only one on sort of the North American side of the continent. Only the base is also the smallest. There's only bed space for 43 people. Living conditions are very crowded. And for example, it's not uncommon for field teams to be there for 4 to 5 months minimum. Our field teams are there for about 6 months every year. My wife and I, before we had our son, used to spend about 6 months a year there every year. Needless to say, it sounds like a great adventure, but when you are having breakfast and lunch and dinner with the same person for 6 months in a row, it gets to be an adventure in tolerance in terms of you have to get really creative in terms of accepting, what people do, what they are, what they think. So what ends up happening is Palmer Station tends to be a very, very close community, very closely knit. Everybody knows everything about everybody. There's no, or very rare, is there any sort of infighting over anything, because we all know that if we get into trouble, it's going to be some of our 42 closest friends that are going to save us. Whether it's accidents or blood transfusions or whatever. So it's, this sounds pretty lame, but it's a world like no one has ever experienced. It is very, very difficult to describe what it's like to live there year in, year out in such a remote and pretty hostile place. So I don't know if that... It's great training for astronauts, and in fact, they're doing that. So I don't know if that answers your question. Believe me, I could go on forever. I've got stories that are killers, but you may want to go to dinner. It's an amazing place. That's all I can tell you. It's really been a privilege to work in this environment with the people I've worked with.